All right, so let's continue. We've talked about the Spanish and the Portuguese in the New World. Let's move north and talk about the struggle for North America. Our objectives in this section: explain why the colony of New France grew slowly. We'll look at the English and see how the establishment and growth of the English colonies happened, certainly relevant to our situation today. We'll look at why the Europeans competed for power in North America and how that struggle in North America is just a small piece of the global struggle between these powers for power and domination. And unfortunately, we'll also look at the impact of this struggle on Native Americans. So our focus question: how did European struggles for power shape the North American continent? France and England, looking to get a piece of what they saw Spain and to some extent Portugal getting, move into North America. And they're doing two things. Number one, they're trying to find the gold that they believe is here. Unfortunately for them, it's not. But they do look for gold. And they're looking for that northwest passage, so that direct passage to Asia through the North American continent. And they keep exploring the coastline and to some extent the interior to find that direct passage to Asia. They don't realize how big the continent is at this point. But regardless, even though they didn't find gold or find that passage, they do find a way to make their colonies very profitable. So remember that, they were successful in the end. By the time we get to 1700, two nations, France and England, control most of North America. The development of these colonies is very different from what we've talked about with the viceroys and the colonies in Spanish America. So think about the differences as we go through both the French and the English colonies. France claims vast amounts of North America during the 1500s. And the first one to make this effort is Jacques Cartier. He is exploring the coastline of the eastern North America. Cartier is the first one to discover the St. Lawrence River. In the wake of the explorers, we have the Jesuit missionaries from France coming over, trying to convert Native Americans to Christianity. So again, with exploration, with a search for gold, comes God, comes the attempt or the efforts to convert Native Americans to Christianity. So Cartier is the first. Now the French, as you can see on the map here, claim large parts of North America, and they explore even beyond that. But settlement was slow, and we'll talk about why that is here in just a bit. The first permanent settlement of the French in North America is actually Quebec, the colony of Quebec, which we know as Quebec in Canada today, in 1608, and that's established by Samuel de Champlain. So if you've ever heard of Lake Champlain, that's named after Samuel de Champlain. But as you can imagine, in the northern parts of North America, farming was very difficult and it was very cold. So first of all, not many settlers came over from France. And those that did come over weren't very successful. But they did very quickly find out that there was a lot of money to be made in fur trapping and fur trading. So I'll bring our little beaver pelt in here. Bring our little beaver pelt in here one more time. So a lot of money, a lot of profit to be made from trapping furs. There was a taste for fur hats, fur coats and the like in Europe, and this wealthy resource of furs in the New World. Very important. In the 1600s, Louis XIV, and we'll talk about all the King Louis in France as we go on here, but Louis XIV wanted to make more money from his colonies in New France, and you can understand why it's called New France. So he sends more settlers over and more soldiers over to North America. Now, one thing he does do, though, remember France, very Catholic country, he does not allow any Protestants from France to come over to New France. Only Catholics are allowed to come over. So between this and the climate, the lack of opportunity for farming, the population in New France throughout this whole time period is much smaller than that of what become the English colonies in the New World. So remember that. Population for New France is always going to be smaller, even though they're exploiting the resources, trapping furs, and exploring North America. Shift gears a little bit and talk about England and the establishment of English colonies on the Atlantic seaboard in the 1600s. The first permanent settlement for the English is in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, and these first folks that came over to Virginia were again looking for gold. They weren't necessarily people that were looking to come over here and farm or necessarily even to establish a permanent colony. They were looking over here to find gold. And when they didn't find that, they struggled to adjust and find new things to do. In the beginning, 1607, 1608, many settlers died from disease and from starvation, and at many times it seemed as though the colony wasn't going to make it. Finally, at some point a little bit later, it does settle on something that is going to allow it to be profitable, and that's the growing of tobacco. Tobacco had been grown by the natives, but it was discovered that there was a type of tobacco coming out of the West Indies that would work very well on the land in Virginia, and Jamestown becomes a tobacco farming economy. And next year in U.S. history, we'll talk much more about John Smith and Pocahontas and others from the Jamestown colony and the struggle in that first winter in the New World. So Jamestown was the first, 1607. The Pilgrims, as I'm sure you're familiar, arrive a little bit north in 1620. Now, interestingly, when the Pilgrims first came over, they had intended to come down to the area right around Jamestown in Virginia, but unfortunately for them, they got lost, and they ended up in Massachusetts, and they decided, what the heck, we're going to stay here. So now the Pilgrims came over not for economic reasons. They came over to find religious freedom. So they were English Protestants who not only rejected the Catholic Church, but rejected the Anglican Church, the Church of England, established by Henry VIII. They were being persecuted in England, and they wanted to find a place where they could freely practice their religion without government interference. Now, on the way over, they decided that they needed to figure out a way to govern themselves. Once they land, once they establish a colony, how are we going to operate? Well, they signed something called the Mayflower Compact, which is going to govern their colony when they get over here. And the Mayflower Compact is an agreement that sets guidelines for the new colony, and it's the first agreement for self-government in the New World. So the Mayflower Compact is significant in the fact that it's the first document that covers the government, some self-government in North America. Now, soon after Jamestown and the Pilgrims land, the English continue to come over and they establish additional colonies in the 1600s and the 1700s. And they're established for different reasons. And we'll talk more about the differences between the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies. But in terms of how they were established, Virginia and New York colonies were basically commercial enterprises. They were organized to make a profit. Not necessarily to find gold at this point, but over time, it's to establish a profit. It could be tobacco, it could be something else. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Maryland were established for religious purposes, so not necessarily economic, but established for those groups looking to practice their religion freely. In the South, the southern colonies, Georgia and South Carolina, these were established basically as gifts from English kings to those people that supported them. So they weren't necessarily commercial enterprises, they weren't religious groups looking to practice religion, they were gifts from supporters of the king. So remember, the English and the French were initially looking to come over and find gold. When they didn't find gold, it took them a bit of time, but they found out that there were other things that they could grow. So we have a wealth created by exploiting the native resources. In the New England colonies in the north, we have industries that are built around fishing, timber, because it's plentiful in the New England woods, and shipbuilding industries. And you'll see some of those cities in New England, Boston and the like, being very important shipping and port economies to drive the growth of the colonies. The middle colonies become known for growing grain, different types of grain, so the breadbasket of the English colonies, if you will. In the south, they continue to grow tobacco, as we saw first established in Jamestown in Virginia, and Virginia becomes a key tobacco state. And as we go back south into the Carolinas, into Georgia, rice is grown there as well. So plantation economies being developed in the south, and we'll talk much more about that as we get into the plantations and the differences between the north and the south a little bit more this year, but also definitely next year. Now remember, I mentioned in the beginning that the development of government in these colonies, in the English and the French colonies, primarily the English we'll talk about here, is very different from what it was like in the Spanish colonies. Now the English colonies had a large degree of self-government. So the colonists could control what was happening in the colonies to a much greater degree than they could in the viceroyalties of Spain. And this comes out of the parliamentary tradition that we've talked about in Spain. So remember, early on, going back to King John, we have the parliament established, guarantees the rights of citizens and also controls to some extent the power of the king, the power of the purse. So it's this tradition which gives rise to more self-government in the English colonies. And each colony has its own representative assembly. They advise the king-appointed royal governor in their colony, but they have a colonial representative body, a representative assembly that governs the day-to-day activities and establishes laws that are particular to that colony. So remember this tradition of self-government in the colonies, not as much control from the king in England. And we'll talk about how that plays out going forward. Okay, in the 1600s, we've got European powers, primarily France and England, beginning to struggle with each other to protect and expand their interests in the New World. Again, by this time, the two main rivals are France and England, and we've talked about them struggling in other parts of the world as well, particularly in India, as we talked about in this unit. By 1754, we have a war developing between England and France, and this war is not just fought in North America. This war is fought in India, this war is fought in Africa, in Europe, and also in North America. Now the global aspect of this war is called the 7 Years' War. The North American part of this war is known as the French and Indian War. That's an important distinction to remember. So the global struggle is the 7 Years' War. Here in the U.S., I shouldn't say U.S. because it's not the U.S. yet, but here in North America, it's the French and Indian War. Begins in 1754. It was a long war. It was a difficult war. In the beginning, the French were very successful, and it looked as though they might, in the end, be ultimately successful, but then the British troops make an advance. They're able to capture the capital of New France, Quebec, and from there they're able to control. And by the time we get to 1763, we have the end of the French and Indian War, or the end of the 7 Years' War, in the Treaty of Paris. So Treaty of Paris, 1763, officially ends the war and establishes British domination in North America. Basically, France is forced to give up most of its territory in the New World. France does retain some sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean and some trading outposts in Africa, but in North America, the French are basically kicked out. So you can see here in the map, the red are the English colonies before the French and Indian War. The pink are British gains as a result of the French and Indian War. So you can see all of New France basically by the time we get to the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. The Treaty of Paris ends and it goes over to Great Britain. So a lot of territory gained by Great Britain as a result of the French and Indian War. All right, our terms. New France, French possession in present-day Canada from the 1500s to 1763. Now remember, not a great population in this area, but a lot of exploration. At one time they control all the way from Canada down to New Orleans. Revenue, income, that makes sense. The Pilgrims, 1620, coming over for religious reasons. Rejecting the Church of England, certainly rejecting the Catholic Church as well, but looking to come over and establish a religious colony where they can practice the way they want to. A compact, the Mayflower Compact, is an agreement among the people, the first document of self-governance in North America. So it's key to remember as a starting point. French and Indian War, part of the Greater 7 Years' War, begins in 1754, ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And the Treaty of Paris, remember, it basically ends New France in North America. All that territory goes over to Great Britain. And that ends our discussion of basically France and England and their struggle for power and control in North America.